Hi, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to another episode of Dyepot Weekly. Today is actually Dyepot Weekly's second birthday and I cannot believe it's been 2 years since we started this series. Normally in these videos I show a new to me or a variation of a yarn dyeing technique that I've tried in the past. And it's actually really fun to go back and look at the beginning of the series to see how much I have grown as an independent dyer. But for this anniversary episode, I wanted to do something a little different today. And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit less about the actual dyeing of the yarn as it is about what happens to the yarn after it has been dyed. No, I'm not talking about a finished knit garment. I've got videos that will feature some of those coming up, so stay tuned. But today we're actually going to take a look at my favorite dip dyed broken violet yarn and talk about the color fading. Now, I do have an FAQ video here on the channel where I talk about food coloring fading over time. And the way that I have observed it is when I left a little knit butterfly on a windowsill over a few months where it got direct sunlight for a couple hours a day, I realized the colors were a lot lighter on the top than they were on the bottom. But some people had reported seeing food coloring fade in the matter of hours, which surprised me since I hadn't observed that personally. So today we're going to take a look at food coloring fading in sunlight and see if we can observe this fast time scale so then maybe we can provide some recommendations on how to avoid this fading in the future. The only times I have observed fast food coloring fading myself have been, well, with food. When I iced a cake once, I mixed a purple and I left it near a window and I noticed the next morning that the colors had faded, that a lot of those purples were looking significantly less purple. I've also seen it in a bottle of sugar sprinkles. The violet ones, you know, the one edge was looking a lot like less pigmented than the other, like it was getting bleached. But I haven't observed this fast time scale on yarn, and I have garments that we wear daily in the winter that are still extremely vibrant. So let's go put this to the test and see what we can see. I dyed 3 different skeins of KnitPicks Wool of the Andes yarn, which is 100% Peruvian Highland wool, in some Wilton's violet food coloring. When I'm doing this dip dyeing, I like to start with 8 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of white vinegar, and then I dissolve 1/2 teaspoon of the Wilton's violet icing color in a 1/2 cup of water, pour that in, and immediately after adding the dye, I start dip dyeing our yarn. I did this 3 times on 3 different skeins. I separated them because I could have done them all in one pot, but it might have been hard. The most I've ever really dip dyed at once is 2. So I decided to do 3 separate ones with the exact same conditions to give us something to compare. All 3 show our broken violet colorway with the purple and magenta towards one end, a medium blue purple, and then the bright blue at the other. We have a beautiful sunny day planned today, and so it's a great day to let some yarn sit outside in the full sun to see if we observe any fading. Now, of these 3 skeins, 2 of them have more blue than the third. So I'm going to keep this one with the less blue, but still has that bright blue pigment at the end inside, and that's going to be our control, so we have something to compare against too. But I think that these 2 are more similar overall, so that's why these are the 2 we're going to send outside. I am not going to label the one that's going to stay inside with no sunlight. I am going to label the one that's just going to go dry in the sun with this orange zip tie. And I'm going to use a purple zip tie on the yarn that I am going to go pre-soak before we set it outside. Because in addition to looking at the scale of fading throughout one day, I want to see if having the yarn wet makes a difference. I am going to go pre-soak this wet skein in some plain tap water for at least 30 minutes. It is 9:30 a.m. and we have our pre-soaked skein and our dry skein outside on a partly cloudy, but also a very sunny day. Now keep in mind that our damp skein on the right does look darker because it's wet. Colors look darker when they are wet, but I spread them out a fair amount, and yeah, we're gonna keep an eye on them and see how they go. I plan to leave them out all day long, and I'm not planning on moving them around because I sort of want to see the fading as it might occur, and if I move them it might make it a little more subtle. But anyway, let's see what happens. It's about an hour in, and it's a little hard to say, but I'm not sure if our wet, and it's still damp, if our wet pinks feel less wet now, or less pink. It definitely is still damp. When I removed it from the water, I did squeeze it out, but I didn't put it through the spin dryer or anything. I wanted it to remain wet. And yeah, I don't know if we're seeing fading there. We might be on the wet one, but we won't know for sure until more time has passed and when it's dry, when we could do a true comparison. There was no bleeding in that bath. It's now been about an hour and 45 minutes, and I am completely convinced we see fading on our damp one. So let's see if I pick this up, see that bright pink, and we're not seeing as much of the pink on top anymore, but beneath, where it's not exposed to the light, we see it. Now, as for our dry skein, I'm in the shadow. There might be some fading, but it's hard to say. Definitely not as much. And this could be consistent with what I observe and why I haven't seen fast scale food coloring fading on my yarn. I dry my hand-dyed yarn inside, away from direct sunlight, so it doesn't experience that fading. And it's possible that on the skein, if I were to leave it out for weeks, I mean, we might still see some fading by the end of the day, but it's possible that it just takes more time when it's dry versus damp. And we are still actually fairly damp. It's a humid day, so that's actually a really good day to do this experiment. A little over 3.5 hours in. This yarn is starting to feel pretty dry, but yeah, that is a lot of fading. The blues, actually there is a bit of a difference. This blue looks more turquoise. This looks more bright blue. Let's see if, oh wow. See that difference? Yeah, there's fading going on there. As for this side, I mean, probably only needed the one. But let's look over here, because here, there might be some fading. Yeah, it looks like there might be some in here, but it's hard to say for sure. I'd have to go back and look, because it could have been a little paler. Anyway, the fading so far in the one that we had laid out that was wet is rather dramatic, and any fading we're seeing on the other one is still fairly subtle. 5.5 hours in, and I'm not seeing a ton of change since the last checkpoint. But looking back through the footage, there was a lot of change even in that first hour on our wet yarn, which of course is no longer wet. But, I mean, on both sides, you can see a lot of our pink has gone. Over here, I mean, I think that we are probably seeing some fading here. It's just harder to tell. Like that blue does look yeah, it's harder to tell. There's no question that one of these has seen a lot more fading, and I am really excited to compare this to the one that has stayed inside all day. Honestly, these colors look a lot more like delphinium blue now versus broken violet. After about 6 hours total, we are now out of the direct sun, but I am still going to leave our yarn out here for the rest of the day, just because there's still some indirect light. I wanted to show a close-up of our pre-soaked skein, and then our dry skein. And it's hard to say because this is the darkest part, but I think there was some fading here, just minimal compared to the other. I think it might rain in a little bit, so I'm going to bring it all in. But it's now 4:30 p.m., so we spent the day outside, and yep, that is different. Let's see this one. Yeah, so see how similar they still look on the side that was facing down. And this one, yeah, I think that there might have been some fading, but it was more subtle overall because a lot of the color on the other side looks like that. So there we go. Here is the broken violet skein that we kept inside yesterday. And don't forget that it did have a smaller patch of this bright blue than the other two. So the actual gradient isn't the same, but we're gonna take a peek at the colors. First, let's bring out our damp skein, which we already know has a significant amount of fading. Looking at this, they look like two completely different colorways. I said yesterday that this looks a bit like delphinium blue, and I sort of stand by that. The colors and the tones have all shifted. But, I mean, if we look back at how it was before, you see some of those colors that were originally present. It does almost have a glazed quality. It could be kind of cool to sort of flip this over and let the other side fade out a bit too. I think that that could be fun. Now is our moment of truth. Here is the yarn that we left in the sun that was dry. And I do now see a difference. Yeah, there's definitely like some reds that are gone, but it's a little hard to say for some of it because I know that this one had more blue to start off than this one. But if we look at the darkest section, this deep magenta, there's no question that we did see some fading here as well. Let's flip it over and look at the other side. And I'm going to turn this around. This is the side that was down when we're outside. And you can see that we have tones, more tones that match here. The magentas are the same and the blues are the same on the side that was not exposed to our sunlight. So there is no question that we saw fading here as well. It's just significantly less dramatic than what we saw when the yarn was wet. On the wet yarn, we saw a difference after even an hour when I went back and looked at the footage. And the scale on our dry skein was a lot slower. It was a lot harder to tell if that fading was happening. And so I think that over time with normal wear, you might see some slow fading of the colors, but again, like it's not going to be extremely obvious without something to compare it to. From a real life standpoint, here is Lucas's hat that he has worn for the last 2 winters. So every day he'd go outside wearing this hat for recess or when we're running to stores. And I keep looking at it to be like, is there some fading? Clearly you still see some red, orange, but the purples do feel a bit more muted. If you compare the outside to the inside, yeah, it looks like we do have some fading, but it's really subtle and you can't say for sure. I mean, it does look like the purples probably faded a bit more than maybe the red and orange, but it is more subtle overall. And again, this was after 2 full complete winters of wear. We frequently store our winter hats inside a basket in a closet, but sometimes they're left on the floor and they're exposed to light. But the hat is still beautiful and vibrant and fun, even with all of that exposure to light. So that's to say that you can wear your garments and yeah, you might see some fading, but you know what? You might see fading on a commercial hat over those longer time scales anyway. Here are 2 more hand-dyed hats This hat actually features the very first 100% wool yarn that I ever dyed. This hat is probably at least 8 years old, and you know what? After 8 winters, maybe I see some fading. But you know what? The colors on the outside are still super bright, and it is my favorite winter hat. This hat has had 1 season, and it's looking pretty good. The inside and the outside don't have a huge difference yet. Just for fun, I want to flip both of these over. Okay. Yeah, on the reverse side, this could almost be the beginning of the video again. So even though the underside is still outside, there's still natural light. It's that direct sunlight that is causing the fading. The results are pretty surprising. I was expecting to see some fading, but I also thought that I might need to do a much larger time scale for this video than I did. And it's possible I could put that dry skein out and look for fading over a longer period of time. But I think that what we learned in just one day gives us some really significant and important conclusions. When you dye yarn with food coloring, dry it out of direct sunlight. It's as simple as that. That's a recommendation I've been making for a while anyway, to avoid direct sunlight, but we saw in the span of even just an hour, we saw some fading of those reds, and it looks like we ended up with a completely different colorway than what we started. Now there was a gap of time between when I dyed this yarn and when I put it outside. And so I don't know if it would be different if it was yarn that I dyed fresh within a week versus dyeing months in the past. But either way, this goes for if you have a sweater and you block it, don't hang it up outside in the sun. Try to find a place inside. And if there's some indirect light, I don't think it'll cause a problem. My drying rack is near a window where we don't get direct sunlight, but there is, natural light in there. And, the yarns are all totally fine. When I store the yarn in my studio, I have them inside plastic bins in a closet. And this is also a room that does not really get direct sunlight. And so I haven't seen fading in here either. When I started posting about this project, people were excited and they were like, ooh, now do this with acid dyes. I don't have plans to do that at this stage because of a timescale issue. There's no doubt that with a lot of reds in general, whatever type of dye you're dealing with, that you can see fading in sunlight. But I'm not sure how many things you might see fading over the scale of one day versus multiple days or weeks. And, it would be a lot different of an experiment to film something like that. Maybe at some point, but given that people were setting things outside in the morning and in the afternoon noticing the color was gone, I knew that I needed to try to replicate this since I had not seen those results personally. And so that's why I decided to try this with food coloring, specifically food coloring that was done with red number 3. Most commercial dyes that are out there do have a manufacturer rating in terms of their light fastness. And you'll see that different colors are more light fast than others. And so this is something that you should consider when, when you're dyeing yarn. Say if you wanted to make a bicycle seat cover, it's something that you should consider if you want to leave something outside all the time. So as these dyes have been developed, these tests have been done. Whereas with food coloring, it's created because they're safe to color our food, not created with the idea of dyeing yarn and garments in mind, so that light fastness wasn't necessarily a consideration in the development of the materials, if that makes sense. All of this is to say, just avoid direct sunlight when you are dyeing things with food coloring. Now, if you make a winter hat, can you wear it outside? Yes. Maybe there was fading from hours and hours of direct sunlight exposure, but nothing nearly as noticeable. And honestly, my kids have hats that they've been wearing for 2 years on a daily basis, and I keep, I'm not positive whether or not there is fading on those hats or not. So just, don't leave things on a windowsill and you'll probably be okay. And if they're wet Especially if you have to dry it outside, find a really shady spot. Hopefully that'll be fine. Just avoid direct sunlight. Avoid direct sunlight. Avoid direct sunlight. From the bottom of my heart, I would like to thank you for supporting the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and enabling me to continue to create content with a subject that I am so passionate about. I love combining color and yarn in many different ways and filming my journey so that way we can all learn together. And there have been mistakes. I make mistakes, and sometimes I say things or have conclusions that aren't correct, but I'm always willing to learn and continue to educate myself. And so I'm glad that so many of you are enjoying this journey as well. And if you're new, make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications. I release new videos every Tuesday and Friday mornings. Tuesdays are always a Dyepot Weekly episode. Fridays are sometimes Dyepot Weekly, sometimes a bonus episode. But in addition to that, I do live streams and other fun bonus content along the way. Now, don't forget that coming up this December, there will be the ChemKnits Hanukkah special, where starting on December 22nd, every night there will be, after sundown, there will be a video. And if you want to sort of increase your experience for that series, you can buy a sampler in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. And these samplers contain wrapped mini skeins that you can unwrap every day and experience the series on another level where you can swatch and play with the colors yourself at home. You can find links to all of this in the video description and iCard. So here's to another year of Dyepot Weekly, and I honestly can't wait to see what other beautiful colors we will create together. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Bye!